Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Community Report Snapshots webinar. We're really happy and honored to have you all with us today to take some time out of your busy schedule to be with us to learn about snapshots from our study. My name is Simon Coulombe. I'm a professor at Laval University. I was a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University at the time the data for this project was collected, and I'm a co-investigator on the research project. Today, we will learn about key findings to help increase awareness of diverse 2S LGBTQ+ students' experiences and needs. We hope that these key findings will contribute to promoting positive changes on campuses and improving 2S LGBTQ+ students' well-being. Before we get started with the agenda, I would like to acknowledge the lands that we are on. Wilfrid Laurier University is on the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. I'm currently in Quebec City, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people. We are grateful for all the Indigenous people who continue to care for and remain interconnected with this land. As settlers, we work to understand colonial legacies and to be allies to Indigenous self-determination. I will ask you to please take a moment to silently acknowledge the land on which you are located, and we encourage you to reflect on the ways that you and your communities might work toward and contribute to reconciliation and decolonization. Thank you for this time. So today we have on the agenda a busy schedule, and we hope you're going to be pleased with learning about the different aspects of our studies and our findings regarding the experiences of 2S LGBTQ+ students in Ontario. So first, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Michael Woodford, who's going to present on the study itself, like presenting the methods and the study overview. Then we'll have 3 snapshots from 3 different members of the team regarding different aspects of the findings. First, more broadly, the experiences on campus regarding the campus climate from 2S LGBTQ+ students and the impact of climate. Then we'll have a presentation on the experiences specifically of BIPOC 2S LGBTQ+ students, followed by a presentation on the role of disability in the experiences of 2S LGBTQ+ students. This will be followed by a discussion with community partners that we are very, very pleased to have with us today. We'll have a kind of a panel discussion focused on what these findings mean on the ground in terms of how we can improve the situation and to better support by 2S LGBTQ+ students and the diverse body of 2S LGBTQ+ students particularly. Finally, we'll have a Q&A period followed by a closing remark. Just before we go to the first presentation by Dr. Michael Woodford, I just want to notify you that there's a way for you to enable live transcription by clicking on closed caption live transcript, and by doing that, you will be able to start viewing the closed captioning. So this is something that you can do at any point throughout the webinar. And also, if you have any questions during the presentation or during the panel discussion or the Q&A particularly, please enter them into the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're not going to be able to answer the question as we are doing the presentation, but we made sure to keep some time at the end of the event, in the last few minutes of the event, for us to ask the question to the presenters. And we're going to make sure throughout the different presentations, we're going to make sure to really keep track of the different questions. So we make sure that they are asked to the participants during the Q&A period at the end. So that's it for the agenda. I hope you're ready. We're going to learn very exciting, important things today that we hope can contribute to your work and to better campus's environment for 2S LGBTQ+ students. Michael, the floor is all yours to introduce us to the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to be here and presenting to give you an overview of the Thriving on Campus study and who our participants were, and then to set the stage for our upcoming Snapshot talks as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and a big thank you to all my colleagues who made this happen. So in terms of the Thriving on Campus study, there are some broad aims that we undertook to achieve through the project. The first, to understand the experiences, the resilience, well-being, and the academic development of diverse 2S LGBTQ students throughout Ontario. And our focus was on university students. And happy to think about what that means also for folks in the college system as well. But also the findings may have implications beyond the province as well. So to think in other contexts as well. And also really to do so was really about trying to enhance services and programs and policies on campuses to make them more responsive to the needs and experiences of 2S LGBTQ students. And one of the features of the Thriving Project is engaging with the university sector throughout the province, and that's been a very strong partner approach to this project. So our study methods, first of all, we were guided by a multi-stakeholder advisory committee that included representatives from student organizations, from the university sector, including student affairs, also service providers working on campuses, and also individuals representing 2S LGBTQ organizations as well. And the advice and support of the committee was invaluable to making this study a reality. The project actually started with a scan of what policies, resources, and services exist on campuses to try to understand sort of that environment and the lay of the land in that regard. And then we moved to a large online survey. And as you can see here, we had close to 4,000 participants. These are individuals who identified as part of the 2S LGBTQ community, attended a university in Ontario. And you can see listed on the slide the various kinds of topics that we investigated, ranging from experiences of discrimination and perceptions of the climate into use of services and experiences using those services, and also knowledge of policies and resources as well. Then we moved into a follow-up stage, which was equally as important as the survey and this environmental scan, in terms of doing follow-up interviews with 50 participants who came from the survey sample and were selected intentionally to have a diverse group of interviewees. The interviews were done online using Zoom to facilitate that access. So we had representation from throughout the province, not just the GTA area, for example. And in those interviews, we explored various topics such as students' identities, their feelings and perceptions of belonging, but also their resilience, experiences with discrimination and what that means for their academic development, and also mental health. And then I think most importantly and sort of excitingly, and you'll hear some of these findings today, is what is it that thriving looks like for queer and trans students, and what does that look like, and what might be some of their recommendations for change. When we look at our survey participants, we have a very diverse group of students who completed the survey. You can see here that we had 29% of the participants identifying as part of the trans and non-binary community, 18% cisgender men, and 52% cisgender women. In terms of sexuality, we also had some great diversity in that regard. And you can see here that the largest group identified as 36% bisexual, 12% lesbian, 17% gay, so on and so forth. These are some of the larger groups that were represented. Then in terms of other demographics for students, we have 28% of the survey who are identifying as BIPOC, 32% who are identifying as religious or spiritual. The average age is 22 years of age, and 17% who said they identified as a disabled student. Other demographics, we think about large percentage of undergrad students, so the majority of the participants. Also, the majority of participants were identified as full-time. 20% of the sample were receiving learning accommodations, and we have great diversity when it comes to the areas of study. Two examples would be 28% coming from social science, technology, engineering, and math fields, and 23% from the social sciences. In terms of our interview participants, again, representing the diversity of the sample, of the survey sample, and also the diversity of students in general, you can see here that we have an even split in terms of 50 students identified as part of the trans community and 25 students identified as cisgender. And we have, for example, 12 students who were both trans and BIPOC, 16 who were trans and disabled and identifying as such. And similarly, we have 8 BIPOC cisgender students and 18 disabled students who are cisgender. And again, across both of these groups, we see diversity in terms of various sexual identities or orientations, with 26% identifying as bisexual, 20% identifying as queer, and so on and so forth. So again, these are the largest groups that are represented amongst those 50 participants. So I want to end on a note of thanks, again, thanking everybody for joining us today, but also to thank our advisory committee members who have worked endlessly, including some people who've stepped off the committee and been replaced by other colleagues, just as life transitions and such happening, job transitions. A very big special thank you to our advisory committee, but also to university staff and student leaders who helped to promote our study and facilitate the engagement of nearly 4,000 people in our survey sample. To the many and endless research staff who've been so dedicated to making thriving a reality. It's been a great pleasure to work with so many people and to support your own development as scholars. I also want to say a very big special gratitude to 2 of our working groups who worked very diligently to create the 2 reports we're going to hear today, or 2 snapshots we're going to hear about community reports. So we have a group of individuals who have lived experience as disabled and also lived experiences as part of the BIPOC community, who worked with our data, supported by members of our team, to come up with the community reports, which will be coming out later this summer. And finally, I, of course, want to say a big special thank you to Simone and Zach and our collaborators who have made, again, thriving a reality. We were funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also to support some pilot study work we did here at Laurier, we received funding from our Division of Student Affairs and the Manual Center for Community Health Research. So, and finally, of course, we want to thank all of the students who participated in the survey, and also those who participated in the interviews. This was a very large undertaking, and obviously the success really depends on the large engagement that we will receive. So we were very, very much in gratitude to them. And finally, is to say a big thank you to everybody who's doing such important work on campuses to advance queer and trans inclusion and well-being and academic success on campuses. It's an ongoing journey. I know for many campuses, and we believe and have received feedback that thriving is certainly helping in that process. So a final note there. And so today, as Simone had mentioned, we are going to be providing an overview of the key findings coming from 3 areas of focus, one being the campus climate for queer and trans students in general, experiences of BIPOC students, and then also experiences of disability and what that means. The 5 community, we will be releasing 5 community reports later this summer. So if you, we will be sending out emails when those are available. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 working groups which are being featured today are comprised of individuals who have lived experiences, and a very big thank you to them. So now we're going to turn it over back to Simone. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for this introduction. Just a reminder, if you have any questions on any of the presentations today, just feel free to write down your question in the Q&A section of Zoom. You should be able to see this button at the bottom of your screen, and at the end towards the end of the webinar, we have a Q&A period in which we will be asking the questions to the presenters. So thanks, Michael. So as you said, we're going to have 3 main snapshots today. So let's start with the first one. So the first snapshot presentation is focused on how 2S LGBTQ+ students experience the campus climate and how campus climate experiences are impacting their well-being and outcomes in general.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Simone. So yeah, I will be giving you a brief snapshot on some of the findings around student experiences on their campuses and how they perceive the inclusivity of the campus climate. There we go. So in my talk, I'll be focusing on experiences of victimization and microaggressions and their impacts, as well as the perceptions of campus climate and those impacts, and finishing up with some recommendations. So students were asked whether they had experienced 6 different types of victimization on their university campus in the past year. And the 3 most common forms of victimization were being followed in a threatening manner, experiencing sexual harassment or sexual assault, and experiencing verbal threats, bullying, or intimidation from other peers or faculty and staff on campus. When we break down the proportion of the students who reported 1 or more types of victimization by students' genders, we can see that cisgender men reported the least amount of blatant victimization, and the remaining groups of students, including non-binary plus, trans, and cisgender women, all tended to hover around nearly 30% of them experiencing 1 or more types of victimization on their campus in the past year. Moving on to trans microaggressions, we examined how many students reported experiencing each microaggression either frequently or very frequently. And these were the 5 most common microaggressions experienced. And from the top, you can see that the most common type of trans microaggression is an environmental one, in which students were encountering forms or documentation that asked about gender and sex, but only included options of male and female. And if you look through these 5 microaggressions, you'll see that there's also interpersonal ones, such as people using the incorrect pronouns or implying that a person's birth sex was their real sex or gender. When we look at the students who encountered 5 or more different trans microaggressions frequently or very frequently, we see that 50% of students who identify on the trans masculine spectrum or on the 43% of students on the trans feminine spectrum, and 31% of students who fell under the non-binary plus umbrella said that they experienced 5 or more types of trans microaggressions frequently or very frequently. And so what we can see is that trans microaggressions are really quite a regular part of many trans and non-binary students' experiences on their university campus. Looking at the 5 most common LGBTQ+ microaggressions, or sexuality-based microaggressions, we can note 2 things. So first, the most common microaggression at the top is again an environmental one, and students reported receiving information about sexual health that was limited to heterosexual sex. The second thing that we can note here is if you look at the proportions on the rightmost column, you can see that while LGBTQ microaggressions are still quite common and definitely very present on campuses, their frequency is quite a bit lower than what trans students were reporting for trans microaggressions. So when we look at the students by sexuality who encountered 5 or more different types of LGBTQ microaggressions, either frequently or very frequently, we can see that across these 5 different groups of sexuality, the proportions range from about 19% of queer students down to 11% of students identifying on the asexual spectrum. So LGBTQ microaggressions are still present to a significant degree, but we can see that they're less pervasive than trans microaggressions. We looked at the impact of blatant victimization and microaggressions on students' likelihood of having seriously considered leaving their university in the past year. So when looking at experiences of blatant victimization, students who reported experiencing at least one type of victimization were 1.6 times more likely to have seriously considered leaving their university relative to students who reported 0 types of victimization in the past year. Reporting 2 types of victimization increased students' likelihood by 2.7 times relative to students who experienced no victimization. For trans students, frequently experiencing trans microaggressions was associated with a 3.3 times higher likelihood of having seriously considered leaving university relative to trans students who rarely experienced trans microaggressions. And finally, students who experienced LGBTQ microaggressions, regardless of their gender identity, were 2.7 times more likely to have seriously considered leaving their university if they frequently experienced those microaggressions versus rarely experiencing them. Looking at the impacts on student mental health, we found that victimization and microaggressions had significant implications for students' reported mental health. So for example, reporting incidents of victimization on campus in the past year tended to decrease students' positive mental health. And positive mental health reflects emotional, social, and psychological well-being. Similarly, experiences of victimization increased students' psychological distress, which is what we might naturally expect. Looking at trans microaggressions and LGBTQ microaggressions, we observed the same kinds of patterns, such that students who reported more frequent experiences of discrimination on campus also tended to report lower positive mental health and greater distress. In another part of the survey, students were asked about their perceptions of how inclusive their campus climates were. These questions centered around distinct aspects of campus climate, and they included the list that you see here. Now, the first 4 are more external about their perceptions of the campus, whereas the final 2 are perceptions about how safe they themselves feel on campus as a function of either their gender identity or their sexuality. In the graph that I'm about to show you, you'll see results on each of these components separately for trans in yellow and LGBTQ plus students in purple. And in the center, we have neutral perceptions, and perceptions on the right part of the graph indicate positive perceptions, and data on the left represent negative perceptions. So as you can see here, most of the perceptions fell on the positive side of the scale for both trans and LGBTQ students, with the exception of pedagogical representation and feeling safe about being open about one's identity for trans students. Now, while that is a good thing, it is important to note that this line here on the scale corresponds to only slightly positive perceptions of inclusive climates. And so while we do see that most of these ratings are on the positive side of the scale, none of them made it to a slightly positive perception. And so really what we're seeing here is a lot of ambivalence and not a great deal of differentiation from neutrality. Nonetheless, we do see that the majority of these ratings are falling on the positive side of neutrality, even if only slightly. Another thing to note here is that across all of these components, trans students reported less positive or more negative perceptions of campus than LGBTQ plus students did, with the exception of collective attitudes and treatment, on which their ratings did not significantly differ from each other. Now, students' perceptions of campus climate had impacts on their academics. And so here and on the next slide, we're going to look at 4 indicators on the left-hand side of campus climate. And then across the top, you'll see that we're looking at academic stress and academic satisfaction separated out for trans students and for LGBTQ plus students. So for all students, we found that not being worried about being mistreated or feeling safe on campus was associated with less academic stress, as you might expect. We also found that various aspects of campus climate differentially were associated with academic satisfaction, more so for LGBTQ plus students than trans students. But the takeaway here is generally that the more positive students' perceptions of inclusion were, the lower their reported academic stress and the more academic satisfaction they tended to report. Looking at the same indicators of campus climate, but this time on their impact on students' mental health, we found that pretty much all of these campus climate indicators were associated with students' positive mental health, but only the students' perceptions of how safe they were on their campuses as a function of their gender identity or their sexuality were related to psychological distress. And so the takeaway here was that the more positive students perceived the inclusivity of their campus climates, the higher their ratings of positive mental health tended to be, and the lower their ratings of psychological distress tended to be. Taking a step back and just quickly summarizing, our data suggests that victimization, discrimination, and perceptions of campus climate inclusivity have important implications for student retention, academics, and well-being. It also showed us that trans and non-binary students were especially likely to experience victimization and discrimination, and they were especially likely to view their campus climates as less inclusive than LGBTQ plus students. And these disparities translated into disparities of outcome such that trans and non-binary students were reporting less positive and more negative outcomes relative to LGBTQ plus students. So based on this data and these results, we have a set of recommendations we'd like to put forward. And the first is to review gender violence and campus climate policies and initiatives, as well as reviewing forms on universities that ask about sex and gender to make sure that they're trans inclusive. Because if you remember back to a slide I presented earlier, 55% of trans students said that they frequently or very frequently experience forms at their universities that don't do this. We also recommend that universities review the health information that is provided by health services to make sure that it's inclusive to the experiences and identities of 2S LGBTQ plus students, as this was a common form of microaggression both for trans students and for LGBTQ plus students. We would recommend that universities create programs that raise awareness about 2S LGBTQ plus microaggressions and their negative effects, and include content on microaggressions in their bystander training programs, and to develop intervention programs that will allow 2S LGBTQ plus students to safely respond to microaggressions. We'd also recommend that universities develop training programs for teaching and learning centers to help ensure that teaching assistants, instructors, and faculty are prepared to promote 2S LGBTQ plus inclusion in the classroom and to ensure that students are seeing themselves represented in the academic content of the classroom. And finally, we would like to recommend that universities ensure that mental health services, academic counseling, and other student services are responsive to the needs and identities of 2S LGBTQ plus students. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harrison, for your presentation and for introducing us to some of our data on the main trends regarding the experiences of 2S LGBTQ plus students in Ontario. A couple of people have asked online in the Q&A box when the survey was administered and the data was collected. So I don't know if this was said or not, but I just want to maybe verbally answer the question. So the surveys were administered in winter 2019, and the interviews took place in the fall 2019, and also in the summer of from the fall 2019 to summer 2020. So just so you all know, and also a couple of other people have asked if they will receive or have access to the recording of the webinar and to the slides. Yes, this is something that we will give access. The attendees will receive an email with access to the recording and the slides. So thanks again, Emerson. Without further ado, let's go to our next presentation. Now that we've looked in the previous presentation at the overall experiences of students from the survey, we want to focus on the next two presentations in the specific experiences of two groups of marginalized students. So the first snapshot is focused on the experiences of BIPOC 2S LGBTQ+ students, and it will be presented by Christina Arrayada.
So as Simone said, my name is Christina. I go by she, her, and Sha. I'm a PhD student, and before I begin, I would just like to take the time to tell you more about where I'm calling in from. So I'm located in Toronto, which is presently known as Toronto. Toronto is a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, and it sits on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Wendat, and is protected by the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon. But like many other treaties, this treaty was broken. The Dish with One Spoon reflects the relationship that we as settlers need to uphold with Indigenous communities. As settlers, we have an obligation to learn and understand the significance of treaties, how they have been broken, and how we are expected to uphold these agreements. While my existence on this land was not by choice, I am not exempted from the privileges I have gained from the systemic oppression and displacement of Indigenous and Black communities. This acknowledgement does not dissolve the responsibility I have. Rather, it signifies the beginning of a lifelong journey of active learning and unlearning to eventually and hopefully walk a true path of allyship. So before I get into the findings of the study, I just want to quickly go through who our participants were. So as Michael described, Thriving consisted of an online survey and follow-up interviews. 1,052 of the survey participants were BIPOC based on their reported race. This includes 22 people who identified as Indigenous. The largest groups of BIPOC students were East Asian students and multiracial students. BIPOC students are diverse in terms of gender identity, with 29% identifying as part of the trans and non-binary community, 52% as cisgender women, and 19% as cisgender men. BIPOC survey participants were the most diverse in terms of sexuality, with the largest group identifying as bisexual. The vast majority were undergraduate students, and they were also diverse in their areas of study, with 36% in the STEM field, and 65% indicated having at least one disability or condition that affects their experiences as a student. Turning to the interview participants, 20 of the 50 interviewed identified as BIPOC, with 4 identified as Indigenous. Like survey participants, interviews were diverse, with most identifying as trans or non-binary. Participant sexualities were also diverse, and they were mostly undergraduate students again, and 17 reported as having a disability or condition that affected their experiences as a student. While I will report on BIPOC students' experiences on campus, to stay true to the emotional and mental labor of both BIPOC students and the Thriving on Campus Working Group, the presentation and community report center how racialized queer students understand and envision thriving on campus. I ask that you keep this in mind as we engage further in the findings. Interview participants continuously identify the need to move beyond basic survival to truly grow and flourish. As this following participant stated, when I think of thriving, I feel like that means growth. There has to be an attempt to grow and encourage things. It's like when a flower is thriving because it's because of the sunlight and it's being watered every day. Based on the findings from our interviews, 3 pillars were identified to achieve a campus environment that would support BIPOC, queer, and trans students thriving. These pillars continue to appear throughout the findings of this report. Holistic support towards thriving includes the ability to feel safe and the ability to express one's full personhood on campus. This requires an integrated and intersectional approach in all areas of campus life. Acceptance and inclusion would be an outcome of holistic support. Participants identified the importance of creating meaningful, diverse spaces where their voices are taken seriously when creating policies and other decision-making processes. Furthermore, students also described the need for tangible and physical markers to represent inclusive campus environments, such as easy-to-access gender-neutral bathrooms and racialized 2S LGBTQ+ faculty and staff. Furthermore, in order to achieve thriving, it's important that racism and intersectionality are centered. The experiences of queer racialized students are complex. Students desire respectful and holistic treatment. While resources exist for queer or racialized students, there is complexity in how oppression and discrimination is experienced when one is both queer and racialized. So to further drill down the point of what it means to thrive, thriving means to do more than just survive, more than just to go through the motions every day. It means to actually be engaged and wanting to improve and continue, and just wanting to grow. As an LGBTQ student, thriving would mean being normal. It would mean that, at least in my case, not be scared of my peers and professors. This demonstrates the relationship between campus safety and belonging towards academic and mental health outcomes. Before I go into the qualitative findings even more, we can turn into the survey findings about campus climate for BIPOC 2S LGBTQ+ students. So it's important to understand the possible effects of campus climate in terms of safety and belonging that they can have, again, on their academic and mental health outcomes. The more BIPOC students felt unsafe on campus, the lower their sense of belonging on campus became. And both campus safety and belonging were related to students' academics, performance, and mental health. This means that for both safety and belonging, a student who reported lower scores tended to indicate lower personal satisfaction with their academic experiences and lower confidence in their academic skills, higher stress, and they would be less likely to want to attend their university again, to name a few. We found the same patterns with respect to mental health, with lower perceived safety and lower belonging connected to greater psychological distress and lower positive mental health. So now we'll look at some of the BIPOC student narratives that help us further understand these statistical findings. So this quote demonstrates experiences of academic exclusion. In some classes, I do not feel not connecting with peers in class, but I don't know if that's related to just the racial identity or if that's also being pansexual. Yeah, it's hard to differentiate sometimes. Like in classes, you have class discussions and you talk to the person next to you. Sometimes I felt that most because I don't know if I felt like I couldn't relate to those people. It was something more subtle. Homophobic and transphobic comments that were not addressed by instructors were common factors that contributed to feelings of academic exclusion. As demonstrated in this quote, experiences of exclusion are nuanced and can reflect students' multiple intersecting identities. It should also be mentioned that course discussions and certain course content that is not managed in a culturally competent way or with racial consciousness also cause feelings of exclusion and discomfort. Importance of creating community involved relationships for participants that included friends, faculty, and allies. These communities were created through one or various shared identities, specifically being queer and or racialized. And these communities provided a feeling and provided a feeling and environment of support that participants were able to tap into when needed. However, finding this support for intersecting identities was challenging, as demonstrated in this quote. So I wish I could change it. I wish I started a war or a riot, and especially what happened this summer at the university, with that Black student getting arrested on campus for 2 hours for no reason, for skateboarding on campus. And in the video where you see he's being arrested, white students are skateboarding. Like that happening just shows the climate of my university doesn't feel safe. This further emphasizes the importance of having holistic support and also having access to those supports when needed. One student described having such support as a very nice security blanket. This was not possible for anyone because many students expressed how their campus was not inclusive. These feelings came from various discriminatory acts, such as racially motivated discrimination. Specifically, experiences that racialized students have and the inability to find others who share similar experiences also brought about feelings of isolation, especially when it had to do with issues of safety. So experiences with 2S LGBTQ plus student campuses, centers, and groups were varied. Throughout the province, some universities have 2S LGBTQ plus student centers and groups, and ideally these spaces are spaces of support, which were true for some interviewees, but not all. 17 of the interviewees shared that their campuses had these centers. While some students benefited from 2S LGBTQ plus centers and groups on their campuses, others did share experiences of discomfort. Feelings of discomfort stem from an environment of whiteness and being spaces mainly comprised of white students. For some interviewees, overly friendly interactions with white students were met with suspicion or discomfort for fear of being tokenized, as they have experienced multiple forms of racial discrimination in other spaces on campus. It is important for campuses to consider where student centers are located as well. A reason why there may be low racialized participation in centers is because of the physical location of these spaces. In some cases, students mentioned that their campus center was located next to campus police, which presented a barrier in accessing the space as it added a feeling of surveillance.
Christina, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You will have 1 more minute to conclude. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem. I'm right on the last slide, so thank you. So based on the experiences, the following recommendations were made for building an ideal campus for BIPOC, queer, and trans students. I ask that you keep in mind the 3 pillars that surround thriving according to the BIPOC interview participants: holistic support, acceptance and inclusion, and centering racism and intersectionality. These visions for thriving fell into 3 major categories: resources and support, training about 2S LGBTQ issues, visibility, awareness, representation, and leadership, and most importantly, systemic reform. Part of receiving holistic care is seeing your identities respected and valued across time and physical spaces. And the following suggestions on these slides reflect those values: centering decolonization in academic and campus planning, meaningful representation of racialized scholars and racialized experiences in the curriculum, inclusive and holistic approaches to student well-being and academic services, better faculty education to increase sensitivity towards 2S LGBTQ+ and racialized experiences, and training regarding indigeneity and two-spirit experiences as well. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Christina. I'm sure if people have more questions to kind of help maybe unpack some of the recommendations and have more information about these recommendations, feel free people to ask the question in the Q&A section. We're gonna have a Q&A period at the end of towards the end of the webinar today. So our next presentation is focused on the experiences of students living with disability based on the data from the study. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Zach Marshall, who will be presenting today on behalf of Isabel Krakow, who is unable to be here today.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for being here today. It's really exciting to have this amazing turnout. So yes, thank you, Simon. My name is Zach Marshall, and I'm a white settler currently in Winnipeg on my way to Calgary. Winnipeg is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota, and is the birthplace of the Métis Nation and the heart of the Métis Nation homeland. So as Simon mentioned, in this presentation was prepared by Isabel, who unfortunately couldn't join us. And Isabel is part of the a working group of individuals identifying as disabled and 2S LGBTQ+, representing undergrad students, grad students, recent graduates, and faculty that work closely with Michael and his other research team members to explore the project's quantitative and qualitative data regarding the experiences of 2S LGBTQ+ students with disabilities. The labor of this group is really key. So I am presenting, and while I am not a member of that working group, I did want to mention that I bring my own lived experience as trans and disabled to my work as a co-investigator and in presenting this work and sharing it with you today. So if we could just go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So I don't know if these are going to stand out to you, these numbers, but nearly 70% of the 2S LGBTQ plus students surveyed reported having a disability or condition that affected their learning access on campus and or interactions with others. Now, you might have remembered the earlier stat, which is that 24% of students reported identifying as disabled. So how do we make sense of this in terms of these differences in numbers? Well, disability is an umbrella term, and the students who were surveyed reported a diversity of different conditions or experiences, including but not limited to physical disabilities, mental illness, chronic conditions, learning disabilities, and neurocognitive disabilities. So we approach disability broadly to include having a disability, as well as conditions or experiences that affect one's experiences as a student, such as learning or experiences on campus. Students were also asked if they identified as disabled, and as we see from this slide, about 1/4 of students who reported having a disability or condition identified as disabled. So in this presentation, one thing to be clear about is that we use the term disabled students throughout the presentation and in the community report to reference students who reported living with a disability or condition and or identified as disabled. And through conversations in the working group, when I'm saying we, this is language coming from the working group. So part of why the working group used this language and we use this language is as a point of reference, is as a point of embracing identity first rather than person first language, because lots of disabled activists and specific disability communities say person first language, make disability out to be a bad thing. That being said, there were important distinctions within the survey sample in terms of people who identified as disabled or not identifying as disabled and related to the outcomes. So we're not going to get into all of those distinctions today, but they are outlined in the report that will be coming out. We can't know from our data why people identify as disabled or not in relation to the survey question. But as a group of people with our varied experiences and knowledges of disability, the working group was able to offer some possible reasons. And you might have those as well as people attending today. Some may not have ever had their disability recognized within common access or accommodations, or some may be discouraged from identifying as disabled by those who perceive disability as a negative thing. So again, when it comes to understanding why those who identify as disabled have worse outcomes, we can only theorize. One reason might be that these students have a keener sense of injustice and might be more aware of or more likely to make note of ableism. So these are things that the group has given a lot of thought to, and as I mentioned, are addressed more thoroughly in the fact sheet. So now that we have a bit of a picture of students with disabilities in the survey, maybe now we can talk about accommodations. So, sorry, I'm just adjusting. There's too many things happening on my screen. Okay, there we go. So as many of you know, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act requires that universities meet the access needs of disabled students. The process for securing accommodations typically includes identifying as disabled, providing proof of disability, and then negotiating accommodations. So for those of you that have been through this or work in this field or have friends, family that do, you know that this is more than just what's written there and is a process. So there are many challenges that students face with accessing disability and accommodation services. And these include disability or condition not recognized by disability services, people who did not identify as disabled, who do not have a doctor to provide necessary assessments or cannot afford the cost of assessments or medical notes or other required documentation. Documents using dead names, and therefore students not this being a barrier to then producing them as proof, and also long wait lists to meet with disability services staff. So even then, once you are able to meet with the staff, there continue to be other barriers after accessing, which include available accommodations do not always meet students' needs. Some accommodations can contribute to financial strain, whether that's because of having to turn down potential income opportunities, inadequate or poor implementation of the accommodations. People also experience barriers from instructors or university staff, and there are limited options for complaints and or mediation. Again, for anybody that has attempted to access these services, these will likely be familiar themes. Now, so we have the experience here of people trying to access accommodations. Then we need to turn to the survey data and think about experiences of victimization. So as we heard earlier, part of the survey asked about experiences of victimization. And here we find that disabled students face more discrimination than their peers without a disability/condition. In terms of experiencing particular types of victimization on campus, we found that disabled students were more likely than students without a disability/condition to report experiencing victimization. For example, they were 2.5 times more likely to have been verbally threatened, almost 6 times more likely to have been followed on campus in a threatening way, and 4 times more likely to have been sexually harassed or assaulted. If we continue thinking then about experiences of victimization, we also need to take into account disabled students' other identities and intersecting experiences. So looking at race and gender, we found that disabled students were more likely to have been victimized on campus than students without a disability or condition. Here these bars report on the likelihood of facing at least one type of victimization in the past year on campus. And this chart shows that disabled students in each subgroup were more likely to have been victimized than their peers without a disability or condition. So when I first looked at this slide, I had a little trouble interpreting it. So I went and checked the report, as I wanted to be able to make sure to explain it clearly. So where it says trans students 4 times, this means that trans students with a disability or condition were 4 times more likely to experience victimization than trans students who did not have a disability or condition. Similarly, for BIPOC students with a disability were 3.7 times more likely to experience victimization than BIPOC students who did not have a disability. And I appreciate the earlier comment about whether we would be reporting all of the information about BIPOC students in this way. In some of our reports we do, and some we're not. So thank you for asking for that clarification. So given these experiences of victimization, we need to also think about how did this impact students' perceptions of safety. So as we saw in Harrison's presentation on climate, both experiences of discrimination and perceptions of climate matter for students' academic development and their well-being. And in terms of the perceived climate, students answered questions about how safe they felt related to their sexuality and trans identity. That was students who are trans got asked about their trans identity and their experiences in relation to it. So our group looked at the role of disability here and found that disabled students reported feeling more unsafe than peers without a disability or condition, both for safety related to being a sexual minority and being part of the trans community. So this raises important questions for us to consider about how issues of ableism related to disability are shaping students' perceptions of the 2S LGBTQ climate on campus.
Zach, you have 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes.
Thank you. As part of the community report, I'll just mention that the group came up with a series of vignettes that were not amalgamations, but that were combined from multiple narratives. And so when you have a chance to see the fact sheets, you'll be able to see some of these vignettes and how they attempt to convey the experiences of 2S LGBTQ students with disabilities on campus. I'll just go to the last few slides here. For students, like Sam mentioned in the vignette, we know that climate matters, and experiences of inclusion, being othered, not being supported can undermine students' academics and well-being. So disabled students reported decreased sense of belonging on campus, such as feeling accepted as part of the campus community. This was especially true for disabled BIPOC students. And they reported less positive instructor relations, for example, comfort in approaching their instructors for advice and assistance. This in turn was related to student outcomes, both academic and psychological, including lower academic satisfaction, greater levels of psychological distress, greater likelihood of having considered leaving the university. And again, this was especially true for BIPOC students. So, through the quantitative data, I'm just getting to the last slide here, small. Through the quantitative data, we see that there was a series of interconnected experiences where 2S LGBTQ plus students with disabilities have unique experiences of the campus climate. Having a disability or a condition was associated with feeling less safe on campus, which was linked to a lower sense of belonging. And those who reported lower belonging also tended to report being less supported by instructors. Unfortunately, then less support from instructors meant disabled students reported more negative academic and mental health outcomes than students without a disability. So as you can see, there are a number of factors possibly shaping the academics and well-being of disabled 2S LGBTQ plus students. And so the working group has focused on two main areas of recommendations, as you see here: culturally responsive support services and fostering equity and inclusion in the classroom, which includes training for instructors, flexible documentation practices, and considering or supporting the move to universal instructional design, which would better support all students. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Zach, and sorry for being the person rushing the presenters.
No, I know you have to. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this presentation and these very insightful and interesting findings. I had to moderate the current presentations because I wanted to make sure that we have enough time for our next part of the webinar, which is a panel discussion with community partners. So we are pleased to have with us 5 different community partners from working in different settings, in different roles. And the goal of the discussion today is to have their perspective on what do these findings mean, what what are some actions that can be taken to improve to LGBTQ plus students' experiences on campus. So first, before we get into discussing findings and their implications, I would like to give each of the panelists the chance to introduce themselves by stating their name, their pronouns if they wish, as well as their organization and affiliation, and maybe sharing in a nutshell how the findings resonate with their work in their organization regarding to LGBTQ plus students and campuses. So let me ask first, Romina, do you want to maybe introduce yourself first, and then we'll go on to the other people?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Romina. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. I'm a campaigns and communications coordinator with the Canadian Federation of Students in the Ontario office. And it was, I had been in some meetings since I believe a year ago, and it has been great to see the validation of what we see with students. Like all of these data, I've seen it with students. The students not only want to be respected on campus, they want to thrive. So seeing these results, it's just, it's empowering that when folks say like, oh, you don't have the numbers, now we actually do have the numbers to sustain what students need and want. So I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you so much, Romina. We're going to have a chance to hear a little bit more from you in a couple of minutes. Allison, you're the next one on my list.
Hi, my name is Allison Burgess. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the director of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office at the University of Toronto. Excuse me, the University of Toronto. Apologies for any background noise. I've got a sick kiddo at home and we're making the best of it to get through today. Just want to echo what's already been said. The research really confirms and concretizes what we know when we do the work in with supporting 2S LGBTQ plus students, and by extension, actually, frankly, for staff and faculty as well. There's a lot of parallels and overlaps. We know that some students are really struggling around questions of discrimination, whether interpersonal or systemic and institutional. But we also know that students are thriving, finding community, and working together. So seeing your research really helps us to concretize that.
Two so much. Shemar.
Hello, my name is Shemar Hackett. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a one of two research and policy analysts over at the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. We're a post-secondary advocacy organization, and the results are very closely connected to a lot of the work that we're doing right now. We run a biennial survey entitled Ontario Undergraduate Student Survey. It's a survey we submit to all of our membership, and we just finished releasing all of the reports earlier this year. And we got a number of reports from students who identified within the community saying they experienced multiple instances of injustice and discrimination within and outside of classrooms. So the findings are definitely timely with some of the things that we've been finding ourselves.
Thanks so much, Shamar. Welcome. Debbie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Olusuacha. I use she, her pronouns, Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And the findings resonate with our work, especially with what we call the older cohort of youth who are in post-secondary institutions. Especially in the conversations we have around myths and dispelling myths, especially with our engagement with those who are about to end high school. There's a sentiment that it gets better when you go to university, and that your experiences as a queer trans youth in high school will be radically different when you go to university, just because of that level of autonomy. And these findings kind of prove what a lot of the youth that we engage with that are in universities have been saying, that the challenges are further complicated as outlined in the results here. And what it also lets us know is that all of these things push young queer and trans people out of the institution of academia, which is systemic violence in itself. And when we talk about the importance of engaging young queer and trans people as leaders, as thought leaders, this is really problematic for our work because we see not only education as contributing to long-term cultural change, but also queer and trans youth playing that role, whether as students or as educators themselves. And so it really resonates with what we're doing and talking about at our organization.
Yes, thanks, Nona.
Thanks, everyone. Nona Robinson, pronouns she, her, and I'm currently the Associate Vice President of Students at Trent University. I'm going to be the Vice Provost Students at York University starting August 15th, so big change there. Yes, I don't want to sound like we're echoing things, so I absolutely have what everyone else has said. Also adding that, I think while these are findings that we would know because of direct contact with students, consultations, even anecdotes, narrative, and so on, it's actually extremely helpful to have a formal academic study, especially when partnering with our academic colleagues, some of whom might want sort of like, show me the data. Well, here it is. And that can make an enormous difference in terms of helping with buy-in. I mean, buy-in is valuable and important, but I think when people are trying to juggle many different things, maybe they aren't prioritizing it the way that they should. And this is the sort of thing that can really help us bring it to the forefront for a lot of folks who may not have thought about it much otherwise.
Yeah, thanks. We're glad that if these findings can serve and contribute to your work, I think we are going to be happy for sure. So as a first kind of question to all of the panelists, that in the campus, in the Thriving on Campus study, one of the kind of central notion is campus climate. We found that in the study that students are facing significant experiences of discrimination, especially trans students face high rates of blatant discrimination, as well as more subtle forms of discrimination, microaggressions, etc. So the first question I would like to ask you is, what might campuses do or do more of in order to create safe or safer environments for LGBTQ+ students, especially for trans students? We can think of both the interpersonal aspects of discrimination, but systemic discrimination also. What can campuses do about this? And I know we had the opportunity to chat a little bit. So I think, Allison, you had some ideas to share with us. I don't know if you want to go first, and Shamar, but feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off. Thanks so much for the question. We had the opportunity to work on a different kind of a study with some student colleagues who identified some of the key themes. So I'm really borrowing from their work. And there's some kind of obvious ones that, I think sometimes get overlooked, which is, how do we think about engaging students in meaningful ways to help create change? And when we engage them to compensate them for their time, for their thought, their work, some of the things that we hear over and over in our office and through the work of our collaboration, sort of internal collaboration, is the constant sense of, in particular for trans and non-binary students, of identities being misunderstood and not considered, right? It's sort of that basic premise of inclusion, right? If you don't consider someone's going to be there, you don't plan for them. And so therefore it's always accommodation. It's always afterthought. There's always sort of this case, just hang on, okay? In a minute, okay, love? Yeah, in just a minute, okay? So it's a case-by-case, resolved case-by-case, rather than kind of that systemic or meaningful change. So finding ways to engage students, staff on what that change can look like, and paying them kind of appropriately. I'll pause now so I can put Daniel Tiger on for the little one. Happy to join again.
No worries. Yeah, I don't know if any of you wants to kind of continue a little bit along these lines. I know, Shamar, you had some points, recommendation from a report.
Yeah, so over at USA, we write roughly 6 policy papers every year, and they expire every 4 years. So 4 years ago, we wrote our policy paper directed at support for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ+ students. And 2 things jump out. The first is looking to increase the amount of permanent physical spaces on campus for queer students. A lot of times, these are spaces that are run either entirely by students or run by student unions on campus. And that that gives way to a lot of precarity in terms of 1 year students may choose to opt out of a lot of services that can significantly defund the resources that these spaces are able to provide to students on campus. So ensuring that institutions or the provincial government is allocating funds towards these physical spaces on campus for them to access support and resources. And I also think it's important it would be very helpful to have a provincial level advisory committee or working group in which it's completely made up of LGBT students and faculty from across the province who could provide strategic advice to the ministry. That should definitely be relied upon more. And I think that's something that's a bit more proactive. Oftentimes I feel the solutions are reactive when looking at training, and even some of these physical spaces are a bit more reactive while helpful, whereas having this committee that can provide strategic advice to the ministry, holistically looking at this sector, I think would be very beneficial.
Thanks so much. Very good, clear and interesting ideas from everyone. Let's go to the next question in the spirit of time. So I think we all know that prior to the pandemic, but even more so during the pandemic and now, there's been a mental health crisis on campuses. The findings that we saw today indicate that negative campus climate can have impacts on students' mental health, especially for 2S LGBTQ+ students who identify as BIPOC or living with disabilities. So thinking about the intersections between gender, race, disability, what do you think are ways that campus mental health services can be better responsive to the intersectional needs of 2S LGBTQ+ students? Debbie, I think you have something to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of just start off answering this question, I think it's always important to note that students have been at the forefront of kind of sharing suggestions to administration on what these services could look like, and they have been for a very long time. And so a lot of what I'm echoing are things that students have continued to advocate for a very, very long time. It was mentioned already in the presentation by one of the younger students earlier, was around having mental health providers who are culturally competent and affirming. And so this could look like many different things, but one I remember from Carleton University specifically was having mental health professionals who also had lived experience from similar to marginalized students, so that there was that feeling of safety in expressing or sharing, sentiments related to queerness, Blackness, disability, etc. Not only that, it's making sure, I think this is a systemic thing and a story for administration, that these roles have to also be like enticing to people to leave community work that they do to want to work on campuses. And I speak as someone who shares community with a lot of queer, in particular Black queer mental health professionals. We need to make sure that these roles are worth leaving what they're doing that might feel different. A lot of people have opinions about universities and what is the environment we're creating. I often use the analogy of how are we preparing the home for somebody's visit. The same thing applies for those mental health providers who are of the same lived experience of the students who need those services. I would think another thing too is recognizing that those who are providing these mental health services need to recognize that a lot of the mental health issues, as expressed in the results, are tied to systemic violence. And so how does that show up on the individual level? But also making sure we're not pathologizing that lived experience at the same time. And this is specifically something that comes up with trans students, where yes, you want a mental health provider to understand trans experience, but not wanting to go back to all of the issues you're dealing with because you're trans. Sometimes the issues you're dealing with is because school sucks, or that you're trying to make sure you're meeting deadlines on time, or that you're developing other chronic illnesses as a result of your mental health issues. Not pathologizing queerness or trans could be really important as well. And so that's ongoing training for all service providers on the mental health side. And then I think lastly, investing in peer support models on campus. I think student-led peer support models are important. They need to be well-funded because it allows BIPOC students to create the mechanisms in place that will reduce isolation and really speak to the needs of what peers want to see on campus. And so whether this is independently run through student unions or funded or supported through administration, but without administration oversight, those peer support models could really be useful as well to ensure those intersectional needs are at the forefront.
Thank you, Sari, for interrupting you. I just want to make sure that we hear also from Ramina and Nona. No worries. It's a very short time period for doing this. So Ramina, you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. I would add an hour more of chatting of this if I could, but yeah, just I think echoing what everybody has been saying, and like the student spaces are so important. A lot of the disclosures of mental health struggles happens between peers. A lot of that discovering of like, oh, actually this doesn't feel like good, and there might be something that is going on in here, happens in a lot of times with peers. So student spaces are very, very important. But beyond this, and I think we can all agree that, yes, we do need more mental health services for students. We need culturally appropriate mental health services. We need racialized counselors and therapists. We need queer mental health professionals. We need to look also beyond what it's considered like professional mental health providers, and there's many ways of healing and students need it. But beyond that, I think what students really need in regards to mental health, and this has been just exposed more with the pandemic, it's the lack of understanding that mental health, it's impacted by the systems. Like it's not an individual issue. Like you can go to therapy for years, you can have the best therapist, but if you're food insecure, if you are deciding between paying your rent or paying books or paying your tuition or, you know, paying the internet, like you cannot have a good mental health. Like it's impossible. If you are being constantly harassed, if you are constantly receiving microaggressions because of your identity, you cannot have a good mental health. So I think it's really important to understand mental health not as an individual issue, but as a systemic issue that puts students in a very precarious situations when you're not able to bring your whole self into the classroom, specifically if there's no supports for you, if you don't see authors of your curriculum or authors of books in your program reflecting your identity. Like how can you do that if you have to go to like maybe the 11th floor to access the only non-gender bathroom on your campus? Like how can you be okay with it? So I think like recommendations going to, we really need to understand mental health as a systemic issue, and how do we target it like that beyond and on top of any personal individual solutions or supports that we can give students.
Thank you, Ramina. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into the Q&A question, and I hope I'm going to find time, I'm sure, to come back to one question that I wanted Nona to answer, but let's go to the Q&A and we can come back. We have a 10-minute kind of blitz to do a couple of questions, including a question to Nona. So if you have questions for the Q&A, feel free to ask them, but put them in the Q&A box, the Q&A function of Zoom. One question that I see here is from Michael Godfrey. Michael is asking, in one of the presentation, it was reported that students were questioning the genuinity of positive interactions with others, and they are likely correct. It's something that Michael has found in their work with 2S LGBTQ students. Michael was wondering, is there anyone on the webinar that has any recommendation for preventing this kind of disingenuous behavior? And sorry for my pronunciation. Not an easy one to pronounce with an accent.
I don't mind starting us off just really quick. I'll say from the student perspective, one thing that would be beneficial is having consistency throughout the school year. For example, for myself, something that provides me solace is knowing everyone's pronouns at the start of a meeting or start of a class. And I feel like in certain spaces, it'll happen on maybe the first day, or we'll have certain conversations and it just won't be carried throughout the semester. So would that be the content that we're learning, certain conversations that we're having? I think trying to find ways to ensure that it's consistent throughout the year, throughout the semester, kind of helps students feel like this is genuine rather than this is something that we're doing just because it's timely or because you're being forced to by the institution.
Thanks. So making sure that it's part of it's planned ahead of time and it's proactive and it's part of the natural way we're doing things. Yeah. Is there any other answer to this question, or should I go to the next one? Anyone wanted to jump in? Or
I can just kind of like expand on what Shamar was saying about, like, yes, it's not genuine when it's done like one time at the beginning of the semester and then it's forgotten. I think that comes, a lot of the students, non-queer students, might feel like, oh, I have to do this pronoun thing now, or I have to, it's like a thing that you have to do, and it's almost like a burden. But I think when it's integrated in everything that you do, I've seen, for example, just having as part of your, if you're reading books, and I go always back to books because I am a book reader and I find they're very powerful. When you let students read a bit of a memoir of like a trans person, the perspective of using correct pronouns and correct names changes completely. So going beyond like, this is like, you have to do kind of like beyond just creating rules of inclusivity, but actually creating those bridges that people are able to see, hey, like this is how this person is experiencing the world, and therefore I will care about it genuinely, versus this is now another thing I have to do, if that makes sense.
yeah, thanks a lot, Romina. One question that we had is from Diana Fialo. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Diana is asking, paraphrasing, can we please have a full conversation in the future on how we can build roles and attract talent to post-secondary institutions to fulfill the evolving well-being needs of SLGBTQ+ students? Any answer to that big? I think it's a important question, but it's also big to answer in 6 minutes. But if you have any thoughts or preliminary thoughts.
Simon, I can maybe jump in very quickly.
Yeah, thank you.
And certainly that is an ongoing challenge. And I was also going to speak very briefly on some of the challenges of being a smaller university in a much smaller community, because I think, as folks know, smaller towns, the range of expertise around counseling and mental health services in particular is probably much less than it would be in Toronto or in Ottawa. So ironically, in a way, the pandemic has actually been extremely positive in that respect. We've been finding, because all of a sudden we've switched from it has to be in person, counseling sessions to, yes, virtual counseling actually works, and it's not that difficult to do. And to the point where counselors in many cases actually prefer doing virtual to doing masks, because it's kind of hard to tell people's body language behind a mask, which has enabled us to actually contract more specialized counseling from Toronto for people who would not otherwise be able to work at Trent, and be able to do it on an as needed demands basis, which has been really, really great. So for example, being able to hire someone who's really focused on LGBTQS supports, and we also partner with CMHA. The Kawartha Pine Ridge District has a great program called Gender Journeys, and we just basically contract them to come to campus in order to be able to provide that support. So these are some things that work really well for smaller institutions, and probably would work well for larger institutions as well. The other thing, and this is maybe just a sort of HRE type thing, is if your university or college doesn't have the ability to basically specify a particular identity in a job description, one of the things that we've been finding is very effective is talking about lived experience in the qualifications. And if that means that you have to have lived experience of being queer and BIPOC, or queer and Indigenous, or any of those sorts of things, queer and disabled, then that really enables you to prioritize candidates who will be able to bring that lived experience to their work. And that is incredibly valuable. Certainly what we've been hearing from our students, as well as when we're able to provide that sort of specialized counseling, it's very, very validating for them, because all of a sudden, even if they're not necessarily taking advantage of that service, it's the university signaling that this needs to be a priority.
Thanks so much, Nana. Thanks for sharing this. Let's go to the next question. The question is from Andrew. Harrison, has there been any other similar study before in Canada that you can compare the data to? Has there been any significant change, positive, negative? If this is something that you can maybe tell us about, this would be useful. Harrison or Michael or anyone on the call.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in really quickly. Michael, you can correct me if I'm missing something, but there's a survey in the States that happens on a yearly basis, and I think every 3 years they do a Canadian cohort as well, and it's a survey that I've worked on together with Michael and Simone. The NCHA data, I believe, is the correct acronym. And so it does provide a really large picture of what's happening with students in Canada. It's not specific to us LGBTQ plus students, but there is a sizable sample of 2S LGBTQ plus students in that data that we can pull from to compare findings. So yeah, if that's something that you're interested in, I'd be happy to chat about that more. You could send me an email afterwards and such. I've got lots of thoughts about that particular study and its value, but there are some studies that exist, yeah, and they do tend to find similar overlapping findings, especially regarding rates of victimization and microaggressions and things like that on campus.
Thank you, Harrison. Michael, do you want to add anything related to that?
I would just,
yeah.
Yeah, no, I will just say that I guess in Canada, we don't have any large scale campus climate studies until Thriving. There are some that are done at some specific institutions. The questions tend to be different and such. Thriving, though, is building off of some work that I did in the US, so we can do some comparisons there. I think in the bigger picture, we would like to do something that is going to be done over time to track not just do things get better or improve, but also what are the implications for students as they progress throughout their post-secondary careers and such. That's something we don't know very much about, and especially what kinds of supports are really impactful and such. So that's, really, and not just, academic supports, but peer supports and the agency and the, resilience and the resistance also of students. That's other areas we should be exploring in the future as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's the end of our time together. I think we would have liked to chat more, and we could have chatted for hours on this with all your all the knowledge that all the community partners have. I think would have liked to hear more, but maybe that's going to be for a future opportunity. I just want to thank everyone who was part of the event today. So presenters and panelists, thank you for taking some time to be with us today out of, I'm sure, your busy schedules. Michael, do you want to conclude with the final closing remark?
Sorry, in order to do that, I needed to stop sharing my screen. Yes, as Simone said, a big thank you to everybody for joining us today, especially to our panelists and our speakers, and to our working groups who've worked so tirelessly on the BIPOC and the disability group. And I also want to say a special thank you to our organizers, including Eric Van Giesen, who's been doing a lot of the technology support and organizing behind the scenes to make today a reality. Please do keep in touch with us. If you have some follow-up questions, our project website is a way to reach us, but also the email address. And everybody who registered today will get a 2 follow-up emails from us. One saying when the recordings and the PowerPoints from today are available, but also when the community reports are going to be available. And we are aiming to have them out in the month of August. So looking forward to sharing those results. So, just finally, thank you everybody, and happy Pride and month. And hopefully today has been an impactful conversation for you. It's been for me, and I've learned a lot, and really appreciate everybody joining us. So thanks everybody, and take good care.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Happy Pride.